There we go. All right. Welcome to this week's episode of the Inclusion Cafe. Today with us, we have Cachet Prescott. Cachet, welcome to the cafe.
How are you, Joe? Welcome to my swanky closet studio.
All right. All right. Well, it sounds amazing. I may have to kind of clean out mine, but mine's very small. It would be like Harry Potter cut in half. So, look, thank you so much for joining me. I have a lot of guests on the show, and a lot of times it's made up of DE&I professionals or people I know from the past that maybe I work with. But there are these few times where I actually get people on that I'm a fan of, and that's what I am. I'm a fan of all things Unlearn podcast. Listen, you are doing a little bit of everything. You are a mom. You are a military spouse, an executive mentor. What else I have? You're a podcaster, superstar, professor, right? You're a professor and a consultant. So I don't know where to start. And I think the best way is to if you could just share a little bit about yourself, kind of dive into some of these for our listeners.
Sure. So, and half the time, I don't even know where to start. But just the journey into just getting into the world of consulting in general, it was because of being a military spouse. As you are very well aware of, there are often hurdles for veterans, military spouses, when it's time to make that transition into any, professional career. And when I met my husband, I met him and I was in a PhD program. We both were at the University of Georgia. And I ended up leaving the program because at that time, that just wasn't the path for me. But when we moved, and went to our first base, there were a lot of hurdles for me over the years. We moved every 2 to 3 years. I'd have to try to figure things out and try to get a new job. And, there was just this dotted, just really interesting look to my resume because there was no consistency, because I was moving so often. And oftentimes the places we moved to, there were just opportunities that just weren't a good fit for me personally. I think when we were chatting before, I was telling you, I had to work at Barnes & Noble just to get out the house at our first base. I had 3 degrees, but I was working at Barnes & Noble. And nothing against Barnes & Noble by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
That just wasn't what I had gone to school for. That's all. I love Barnes & Noble, as a matter of fact. I love books.
Oh, I love it too. I used to go and just sit there like for hours.
Exactly. But I just hadn't gone to school to do the job that I was doing. That's it. So it was just frustrating, and I just kind of, necessity is the mother of invention. I fell into entrepreneurship, and it's been an amazing path. And I'm a trained social scientist, so my background is in sociology and psychology, and that's what I teach. And now I teach psychology classes online, and so this work in the DEI space is very well in line with who I am as a person. I am extremely passionate about just fairness, just people being accepted for who they are, whatever that might look like. I tend to say that my superpower is empathy. So it really fits into the work that it is that I do in terms. So I call myself or brand myself being the virtual inclusion strategist. With a primary focus on remote work, especially with everything that's going on. In that mass transition to virtual work. Oftentimes people just assume that because we have virtual work and remote work opportunities and these distributed workforces that this automatically increases diversity. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And oftentimes those DEI or DEIB issues are more so exacerbated in a remote workforce. And so just having those conversations around that. And outside of the professional stuff, I am a mommy to 3 girls whose names all start with S. I thought it was cute at the time, but now I know that was just a bad idea. So we just refer to them as triple S.
There you go. So you know me, we chat a little bit, of course, getting to know each other. I have 5 boys. So you have all girls, I have all boys.
Yes.
And it's funny you say your background education wise is social science. wonder how much of a benefit that is even for parents like you and I who have multiple kids.
Man.
I tell people, if you want a crash course in relationship management, have kids. Have kids. And have more than one. Get 2 or 3 personalities under your belt. I don't know. I don't know how my wife does it. I don't know how she's going to not finish raising these kids without like PTSD. And that's not making light by any means of PTSD, but
no, it's definitely been an adventure, and the social sciences background has definitely come in handy. But even for the stuff that I'm very well aware of, I still fall victim to those things. I'm like, oh, you knew that though.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I think, Cachet, we're kindred spirits. I don't have an education background in social science, but I've developed mantras that I try to live by, and my tagline to them all is, people are my profession, connection and conversation are my addiction. Right.
I love it.
And that's, I tell everybody I come across that's my elevator pitch. I just used it at my MBA, executive MBA course this past week.
I love it.
It just best describes my heart around it all. Right. Because let's be honest, I'm not the person in the room that you pick out to be the D&I guy or the guy who works in inclusion. I'm a white male. I sound like I'm a white male from Northeast Georgia, right? With this crazy accent. But I'm really, passionate about people just like you. I'm passionate about equality and equity. And I focus, a lot of that time, effort, and energy into the workplace. So out of all of these things that you are involved in and that, kind of are part of your identity, I want to talk about your podcast, All Things Unlearned. Can you talk a little bit about that? And us podcasters have to stick together here, but you have a thought process behind your podcast, and tell us about it. And what is this unlearning your champion?
So All Things Unlearned just came from personal life experiences, really and truly. Probably in my mid 30s, I was just at this place and space where I was just kind of like, I don't know. I just felt unhappy. I felt unfulfilled. And I just felt like I was just kind of going through the motions. I felt like I had kind of lost my identity. I was my husband's wife. I was a military spouse whose career, quite frankly, played second fiddle to my husband's career because we have to go wherever his job goes and his job dictates. And, I was my kid's mother. And some people will say, well, you knew what you were signing on for when you became a military spouse. You honestly don't know.
No.
You could never fully prepare yourself. You think you know, but you don't really know. And so it was definitely a challenge for me to really find my own way at that point in time. And so over the past few years, I was learning stuff about myself that, quite frankly, weren't things that I was proud of. For instance, I tell the story often about how I kind of stumbled into unlearning. We had a family friend of ours a few years ago that said, hey, let's meet up for Friday night. So I connected with her, and she just said to me in a loving way, as loving she possibly could, you're always offended by everything. And of course, in that moment, I was offended. Like you said,
I think I would have offended. I think that situation would have been hard not to be.
And then I shut my mouth and I listened to what she had to say. And, we were there probably an hour or two, not her just talking about me being offended an hour or two, but she explained her reasoning. And afterwards, because I am a learner, I went to Amazon and looked up books on offense.
Okay.
And one of the books that came up was called The Bait of Satan. I'm a Christian, so that spoke to me. And I think it's by John Bevere. And I read that book and I was like, oh my goodness, he wrote this book about me.
Oh, wow.
I was just like, oh my gosh. And even though I didn't know what this thing was called, I started kind of deconstructing, why I operated in this place and space of offense. How
Mm.
had it been serving me? What was the effect of me living in this place and space? And that was really the start of unlearning for me, but I didn't know that's what it was called.
Right.
And then so over the next few years, I started looking at things that just really weren't serving the person I wanted to be at that stage of life.
Mm.
And I was teaching an effective communications class earlier this year or end of last year, earlier this year, I believe. And I just thought about, let's talk about communication and the things that you learned from, way back when, even when you were a child. How do they affect the communicator you are today? And that conversation was just such a good conversation because it really was an aha moment for everybody in that class. Like, oh, well, I kind of do this because of, when I was growing up, my parents didn't allow me to speak. So now I am very, quiet. I don't say much. I don't speak up when I should. And it was such a good conversation. And then somehow I came across the term of unlearning, and it really resonated with me. I was just like, okay, this is exactly what I've been doing. This is exactly what I've been talking about in my classes. And there was another podcast called Jesus and Jollof that I listened to with Lovey Ajayi Jones and Yvonne Orji. And I had already made it up in my mind that I was going to probably do this podcast on unlearning. And I listened to their season 3 trailer, and the theme of season 3 was unlearning.
Convenient.
That's
awesome.
I was like, yay, this feels like a sign that I should move forward. But then
thumbs up.
Yeah, and I was like, oh, they're already talking about this. They already have a big audience. Who would want to listen to my podcast when they can listen to theirs? And so that I had to start even on myself when I was just like, you know what? It is what it is. Mm-hmm. You've had this idea in your mind. This feels like confirmation, and you need to unlearn that fear and press forward anyway. And so I ended up launching the podcast in May, and my first season is out. And it's just been such an interesting conversation, talking to people about their specific unlearning journeys, the things that they struggled with, the things that they had to let go of to become who it is that they wanted to be, to just be a better person in whatever capacity. And it's been so many interesting conversations. I knew that I wasn't the only one that was going through this, but again, I don't think people have the language for what exactly it is. And it really is to focus on this idea of unlearning as a form of learning. Wow. And again, oftentimes when we are stuck, we will go into self-help mode and go get the self-help books and add more information. But if you are starting off with a faulty, kind of knowledge base with information that is not serving you, it's going to be counterproductive because you're not going to be able to move forward until you let go of those beliefs, those thoughts, those systems, those words, those actions, those perspectives that are getting in your way. So that's really how All Things Unlearned came to life.
Yeah, I love that. I love hearing how, again, podcaster to podcaster, how it develops and how it comes true. And what I love about All Things Unlearning, or All Things Unlearned, right?
Yes.
Is every guest you have on there. This first season has 10 episodes, right? I believe, yes. Right? I think it's 10 episodes, and I haven't gotten through them all, but everybody brings vulnerability to the table.
Absolutely.
And you were talking about, well, someone did this other episode and you were a little worried about that, but that's one episode and there's probably a lower level of vulnerability in that episode. So I think it's phenomenal what you're doing and allowing guests to come on and be vulnerable, because when you ask somebody, hey, what's a habit you want to unlearn, right? A lot of times people think they're going to immediately, associate that with a bad habit. Well, all habits that you want to unlearn aren't necessarily bad for you, but maybe there's a better way of doing it. Or maybe, again, like you said,
Absolutely.
learning through unlearning. So it's just like in job interviews where they ask you, what's your weakness? And you say, but you turn around, make it a strength, right? It's the same concept, right? But I was self-conscious about starting the Inclusion Cafe. I really was. I went about a year and a half, almost 2 years throwing this thing around because,
Me too.
there are so many D&I and inclusion podcasts out there with different focuses.
Sure.
I didn't see any really focused in the workplace, but I'm a huge Jennifer Brown follower, right?
Yes.
And so, and I think I think you and I may have kind of connected through some posts on LinkedIn
Yes.
from her. So, but the will to change is amazing. And
It is.
I looked at that and I was like, yeah, I'm nowhere there in my depth of knowledge for it. So my whole point in sharing that with you is I get it. I get what you went through and kind of the arriving, but I'm glad you arrived at the place where you're now at with it, because it's a daily lesson for me.
Well,
And
I
if not
appreciate
daily, it's at least 3 times a week. So one thing I do want to follow up before we start talking about workplace inclusion, because yes, I am a military veteran, and I absolutely understand the struggles that military spouses go through. And something you said about people telling you what you signed up for. Well, I agree. It's absolutely untrue. You can't imagine, especially and I believe you said your husband's a career veteran,
yes.
right? It's been
Mhm.
in 20 years, at least between 10 and 20 years.
So
So
at this point, he's been in 14.
okay, so 14 years, right? So you come into this a lot of times, you know, when we're younger in life. I came in my early 20s, right? So no one really understands what they're getting into.
Absolutely
Um,
not.
and you do. I hear this all the time, that military spouses lose their identity. And I've never ever felt that way, right? Because why would I? I've never been in these types of situations
Sure.
where I've had to fully sacrifice like that. Like, you're literally putting your career on hold. A lot of spouses shape their aspirations based off the next duty station, or
Exactly.
you know. But that being said, it seems like you have a good formula here, right? Entrepreneurship. And I wonder if that's the pathway to kind of help military spouses negate these big disconnects that they find in these battles they're having getting back into corporate America, because the military rotation in all 5 branches is never going to change. It's always going to be
Absolutely.
move every 2 to 3 years. But I wonder, just thinking, I wonder if entrepreneurship is maybe not the answer, but a answer.
Well, I think that has become an answer for a lot of military spouses. Now there are so many different amazing resources that are dedicated to helping mil spousepreneurs
Yeah, I
really,
love that.
really thrive. There are associations for mil spouse entrepreneurs. There are Facebook groups, communities, all types of options. The Veterans Business Outreach Center, the VBOC. If you may have one of those near you, or you may not. They cater to veterans, of course, but they also help military spouses with their businesses. There are so many resources out there because they recognize that this is an issue. I used to be an instructor for Boots to Business, and it typically is for transitioning service members,
Mhm.
but it's also open to military spouses to be able to attend. And it's a 2-day intensive entrepreneurial training, just to give them an idea, like, okay, talking about all aspects of starting a business. And so I think they recognize that this is an issue. And I think a lot of military spouses are really trying to take charge of their career prospects and explore this as an option. I recognize entrepreneurship is not for everyone. It is not the answer for everyone. But for me, this was an amazing way for me to create a portable career opportunity so I could take it wherever I go, and also to create an opportunity that fulfills me, doing the work that I love, I care about, that is significant to
Mm.
me.
Wow.
And that's, for me as a person, significance matters. I didn't want to just do a job. I wanted to have a career, a fulfilling career. And so entrepreneurship has afforded me the opportunity to do just that.
Right. Mm. Yeah, I am a firm believer in the path or the road to success is a lot quicker if you're passionate about what you're doing.
Definitely.
Right. It's it has been for me. And yes, my profession is DE&I, but I get so much more than a paycheck, right? Out of my job. I'm one of the lucky few who get to wake up every day and not only live their passion, but operate in it on a daily basis. It's in everything I do, from my parenting, from my profession, to just, me being. So I get it. So let's talk about inclusion in the workplace, right? Because that's what we love to talk about here in the cafe.
Exactly.
So there's an issue with inclusion in the workplace, and a little bit, right? And I tell people all the time, I'm the biggest defender of corporate leadership, because I like to think that it's not out of malice. It's out of lack of knowing how to create inclusion or understanding how they got to where they're at. But it's a lack of education, right? It's a lack of unlearning behaviors that have either got them there or are preventing inclusion, right? And it's things around unconscious bias, stereotypes, or just not paying attention, right? Just not paying attention. So that being said, a question I have is, from an organization or a business perspective, what are some behaviors that those companies passionate about in creating an inclusion or an inclusive environment, what are some of the behaviors they may need to unlearn?
So you bring up one major one, this idea of unconscious bias. And with unconscious bias, people often get very uncomfortable with it because they believe, okay, you're saying something negative about me if you insinuate that I operate from bias in any way, shape, or form. But really and truly, we all do. It's just, we're human beings. We have bias. And it's not because, like you said, it's not necessarily because we're trying to willfully be, operate from a negative place or space. It's just because oftentimes our biases come from these mental shortcuts that we take, I often talk about Daniel Kahneman and his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and the idea of systems 1 thinking versus systems 2 thinking. Systems 1 is that fast, instantaneous, stuff you don't even have to think about. So for instance, when you get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you wash your face, you get dressed. You do that almost automatically without thinking about it whatsoever.
Right.
But then there's the systems 2 thinking that actually requires you to think about something. It's deep thought. So if you're doing a difficult math problem, you can't just automatically come up with the answer. You have to actually give it some thought, work through it, process the information. And systems 1 thinking does benefit us in some way, shape, or form because it helps us to move throughout our days. Can you imagine if we had to go through our days doing this longer processing of system 2 thinking for every single thing that we had to do?
Yeah.
Even in brushing your teeth, having to think about open your mouth, insert toothbrush, and then go up. That we would be incapacitated if we had to think like that about everything. So the heuristics or the mental shortcuts that we develop definitely serve us in some capacity. But the issue is when they, become a bias or, something that we're operating from and leaning on that comes to the detriment of other people or those around us. And so biases do serve us to some degree. But there's also the negative side of the biases where, we have either we favor something or say favor a person, a thing, a concept, a person, an organization, a group, whatever the case might be, or we're opposed to them in some way, shape, or form. So when I talk about bias, for instance, there's the affinity bias. Yeah. So we like people that are like us.
Right.
Nothing wrong with that in and of itself. But it becomes a problem when it's to the exclusion of other people. So one example I can think of is even in decision making in the workplace. Oftentimes leaders might, surround themselves with people that may think like them, may look like them, may operate in the way that they operate, because they're like, I know these people, I like these people, I trust their judgment, because their judgments are like my judgments.
Right.
But that lack of diversity in the decision-making process definitely leaves a lot of room for error, because just because you think it doesn't necessarily make it so. So if you're operating from this place and space of, I'm not going to involve other people's ideas because they're not necessarily similar to mine, or we don't have the same beliefs, you're not leaving room for people to ask you the hard questions, to make you think about things that might be contradictory to what you believe, to challenge you, to show you a different way of doing things. And so that's where, that's one way in which it shows up. Or even the idea of hiring, when we are talking to individuals, if you're operating from this unconscious bias, because generally speaking, we often don't recognize that this is because, again, if you're operating from a place and space of systems one thinking or a heuristic, it's unconscious. You don't recognize that it's happening. So if you're on a hiring panel, or you're talking to a potential candidate, again, it could be that affinity bias at play. It could be, the recency bias, where you're going to remember, the
last bit of information
and that last bit of information about that person. And you're just, yeah, that person was great. Even though there were people before that might have been just as great. But because of the recency effect, you're really honing in on that. And there's so many, again, different types of bias that can be at play. Or you have these, you'll express these micro affirmations when it comes to the people that you like. So if they do something, so if they come in and a person's feeling uncomfortable and they're, just kind of acting shy, you'll excuse their behavior, because you're just, they may be a little tired, they may be a bit frazzled, just coming in from the rain, whatever the case is. Right. But if it's somebody else that you don't identify with, you may inadvertently start to express kind of those microaggressions and see faults in the things that they're doing. I'm like, oh, well, you came in, they're kind of slumped over, may not be a best fit for this job, when that's not necessarily the case. They may have had the same circumstances, but again, because you identify with one over the other, you have all this going on in your head and you don't even realize that it's at play. And so these are just a few of the things that we have to keep in mind, because again, they're unconscious. You don't realize it's happening, but it's happening. So,
yeah, well, first off, think fast and slow. Is it think fast? Thinking fast and slow. That's the second time this book has been brought up in conversations.
Really?
Less than a week. So it's going on the
message
today. Right. So my friend Sajal Thacker, I don't know if you've seen some of her content on LinkedIn. She is she's a self-proclaimed legal training ninja. She's an attorney that does corporate law and
stuff. She was on your podcast, right?
Yeah, she was. Absolutely.
She was that episode. Yes.
I think she was my second guest.
Yes, I listened to that episode. Yep.
But yeah, and if you remember, it was around unconscious bias, and what Sajal calls it is unconscious beliefs, and I love that beliefs, right? Because really, that's what it is. And I don't think, and maybe you disagree here. I don't know if unconscious beliefs is something we can fully unlearn as we learn how to operate in it, to where it's not exclusive, to where it is inclusive, right? I think there are some unconscious biases and beliefs that absolutely we unlearn, right? Especially if they're stereotype or racism or anything like that. That's critical, because racism, even religion, all that stuff is learned, right? So anything around those subjects can be unlearned. But one thing, well, first, what are your thoughts around kind of what I said?
So I do believe to some degree that there are some things that are super ingrained in us that that it is very challenging to completely remove them from, who you are in your
Right.
DNA. Not to say that you can't, but there are some things that are much more challenging than others. And like I said, like you said, I think that's a great way to put it, is to really learn to better navigate those things as you work through it. For some things, you will completely unlearn it. For other things, I don't believe it's that simple. So yeah, I
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah, because I think that, I think when that unconscious, as Sage calls it, belief are harmful to anything external to you, right? That's not, I think that's absolutely a behavior that warrants unlearning, right?
Definitely.
So we have a few moments left, Cachet, and I want to, well, there's one other question I wanted to get to.
Sure.
So this may be the first episode we go like over the 45-minute mark here, because we're having, I had a feeling we would. What questions do people, I mean, us as humans, and also leaders, well, I guess that would encompass them, but what are the questions we need to ask ourselves to kind of help us identify behaviors
Sure.
maybe we should unlearn, right? How do we go and do that mental self-assessment? Because yours was spawned out of a conversation with a friend, right? And you were like, okay,
Yes.
I want to come back, but now you went on this deep dive journey. You pulled back and you said, you know what? I identified that, but it was brought to your attention. You may or may not have ever
Absolutely.
identified that about yourself.
Absolutely.
And based off that one conversation, you may have never even been right here where you're at now.
Very true.
But a lot of us don't have those aha moments and things. But
No.
so what are the questions? How do we do this self-assessment?
Well, it's definitely not an easy thing because, as we mentioned, a lot of this stuff is just unconscious.
Right.
We don't realize that it's even a problem. But for some people that are more introspective, or some people that are a bit more self-aware, really just kind of assessing. And one thing I want to make clear is unlearning is a very uncomfortable process because it does force you to really ask yourself the hard questions, and oftentimes that's not fun. To think that there are some things that could be just not so great, that's not fun. But for the more self-aware, I challenge people to really assess and choose a particular area. So of course we're talking about DE&I, but when I'm talking on my podcast, this is more so about personal development and growth. But choose one area, and let's just specifically focus on DE&I.
Okay.
So if it comes to this idea of unconscious bias, I often challenge people. I give them just kind of a 7-day challenge. Go back to your workplace and choose a specific area. Again, it could be in your communication. It could be in your decision making. It could be in your leadership, whichever area. Choose one area, because otherwise it can get very overwhelming. And start to just really look at how you operate as a person. If it's decision making, when you're making your decisions, think about who do you typically call on to involve in those decisions. Why do you call on those people? What is it about what is your decision making process? How does this serve you? Thinking about these things and just honestly answering the questions, because if you don't honestly answer the question, this whole exercise does nothing for you. But thinking about that, and also thinking about the people that you do not include on the conversations that could be involved in the decision-making process. Why is it that you do not call on these people? What is it about your interactions or your relationship with these people that may color your experience of them and their involvement in the process? Because of course, that's also going to inform you as to where you may be erring. Also, if you're comfortable enough doing so and open to hearing, the honest feedback, touching bases with people that will objectively tell you about yourself. So whether that's a mentor, a peer, a significant other, asking them when it comes to decision making, what they have seen of you as a person and how you do this and, how you move when it comes to decision making. Because as you mentioned, we often cannot see ourselves, but really asking those hard questions, assessing, trying to get a better idea as to the things that you have done, the things that you are doing, that may not be helpful to your process, that may not serve you, that may go against what it is that you're trying to do. Because oftentimes we may believe that we have certain beliefs so for instance, we may believe that we don't act in this way that might be biased in some way, shape, or form. And that's a whole other bias. It's the blind spot bias,
Yeah.
Where we can easily point it out in everybody else.
It's right here.
But what is right here, you cannot see the plank in your own eye.
Yeah.
And so you have to be open to the fact that, okay, yeah, this is a possibility. Yeah, this is something that I might be dealing with. And again, when it comes to the conversation about what that looks like, you have to be open to the fact that, hey, I'm human.
Right.
I am biased to some degree. How does that show up? How has it served me? Because oftentimes our biases do serve. We have these particular behaviors because they serve us in some capacity. But on the flip side, just because it has served me, is it continuing to serve me? And what might be the effects of me continuing in this vein?
Right.
Because you need to see the potential future consequences of your actions and how that may affect you, your leadership capacity, those around you, your organization, the work that you're doing. It could have a ripple effect. So,
thank you for the answer. It's really deep. I feel like a lot of it starts with conversation, and I actually have another question. All these questions I listen to you, and this can be either from your perspective as in the workplace or just society in general. Are we getting better at having these conversations and being vulnerable like this, or are we getting worse? And the reason I ask that is because society is so right. It's deep. I know. So I like to get into deep talk on these.
I love that too, though.
So society, at least American society, we're split. It's completely divided right now.
Yes.
For many reasons.
Yes.
And where we're at one time we were semi-woven. Or at least trying to get there, but now we're completely disconnected. Yes. Because of that, I think people are being less vulnerable, and if people are being less vulnerable, conversations like this and unlearning behaviors, I feel that it's going to be more difficult. I mean, what are your thoughts around this? Are we getting better at this, worse at this, or are we stagnant at this?
I think, generally speaking, it feels like we are getting worse. And that's for a variety of reasons. Unfortunately, I think, although we have the internet now, and we have access to so much information, which leads to information overload. But we also have access to so many different platforms to speak and get the word out and say what we want to say. And oftentimes there's a lot of vitriol out there. Not a lot of grace extended to people that may have the best of intentions in what they're trying to say, what they're trying to communicate, what they're trying to get across. It takes one trip up for people to just attack.
That's it.
And to jump down your throat. And so understandably, people are very reluctant to speak about these things or speak up or to share their thoughts, their perspectives. I feel like, generally speaking, we're not allowed to have opinions or differences in opinions without people attacking you for that difference in opinion. My thought is, hey, agree to disagree. Right. We have our own perspectives.
That's right.
And that is okay. That's what makes us amazing as people. Again, different doesn't have to equal detrimental.
Right.
And that leaves room for us to talk and explore this thing that we might have differences on.
Yeah, I would agree fully. And I'll go, a step further, that I believe that yes, we all should have our opinions and our ideas and thoughts, to the extent of, or to the restriction of, if it's harmful to someone else.
Sure.
And then,
Absolutely.
because so I don't know if you saw the article from the Wells Fargo CEO.
Yes.
Did you see that? And
Yes.
it was a big thing, right? And everybody's like asking me, Joe, what do you think about this? And if you notice, I didn't post anything publicly about this. And here's why, right? It goes back to what I was talking about around leadership and just uneducation, just not aware. And in this scenario, I want to loosely use the word tone deaf, right?
Definitely.
Because what he said was basically, there's no black talent in finance. That's what he said, right?
He did.
Which is, if that's the words that are printed and come out of your mouth, that's what people are going to.
That is
right?
the gist of it.
Right. What I hope, and the reason I didn't comment, is what he was saying is that there's some statistics around senior executive vice presidents with Wall Street experience. There is not a very diverse or demographically represented, say, for Black or African American talent in the workforce for that, right? Versus saying basically Black people don't get finance, which is the way it came off, right?
That's absolutely how it came off.
And that's the way it made people feel. So it's important, right, to think before you speak when we're talking about this stuff.
It's absolutely important, and that was a PR thing.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons we're really disconnected, right? People aren't thinking before they say, just like you mentioned. And then you have, of course, the government outlawing DE&I training. So it's like, what? It's like all these things.
A whole other conversation.
Right, exactly. But it's that drastic. Yeah. That's drastic, where we're screaming for inclusion, and then that. So it's
disturbing. I just wish that we could really not assume the worst in everyone.
Exactly.
There are some people that is their intention, and there's nothing you can do about those individuals. I'm not talking about those individuals, those that intentionally seek to be harmful or hateful. I'm not talking about them.
Yeah.
But for the people that might be in between, that it may not be their intention to be operate from a negative place and space. I wish that we again would extend some grace to each other. Seek first to understand, then to be understood as well, and to meet each other where we are, to make space for these conversations and to make space for genuine understanding. I wish we could get to that, more of that.
Yeah, I do too. And I hope there is a turning point where we start migrating that, and a turning point that doesn't, sadly include a body count, right? We want to get there organically, and we want to get there through conversation in the right way, both in the workplace and in society. So.
Absolutely. And you are creating the space for that with this podcast. So I thank you for the work that you do.
No, Cachet, thank you for everything you're doing as well. I am, as I said, I'm a fan, and I am a fan of unlearning. I have, over the past probably year and a half, went through, well, probably about 3 years, a session of unlearning myself. I didn't know it was unlearning. But maybe that's a conversation for you and I at another time. So
absolutely.
I want to thank you for being on the show. It has been an absolute pleasure, and wow, what a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Joe, for having me.
Absolutely.